Bretonnia are best known for their cavalry and dedication to the lady. Wherever she walks, they follow. Wherever she sits, they sniff. But if you want to go up against them, you're going to need to be ready to keep up with their mammoth pace both in combat and on the campaign map. So let's get into how to beat Bretonnia. Honestly, the campaign side for Bretonnia is pretty empty. They're not awful, but they just don't really have a lot of mechanics which make them uniquely challenging to go up against. They're just a normal faction that progresses at a mid to high pace in most games. The main issue you'll run into when fighting them is their order-tied status. Since they're a quote-unquote good faction, that means they'll likely be allies with most of the other quote-unquote good factions, and that means taking the fight to them can sometimes mean bringing far more war to your front door than you bargained for, you freaking bore. This becomes more of a problem the longer the game goes on, since early on alliances don't generally exist, but if you get past turn 50, chances are they're building the foundations of their relationship and going to dinner fairly regularly. So to get around this, you have two options. Option 1 is pulling me when Isabella steps on me and busting in there early. If you take the fight to them before they can build an alliance, then this is pretty much a non-issue. Sure, they might be able to pay some nearby friends to come help, but the chance of that happening is much lower than if they're actively in an alliance later on. Option 2 is using the Join War exploit to declare war on just them without triggering the whole alliance at once. If you somehow don't know how to do this, you just find someone who's already at war with them, offer to join the war against just them, and that's it. This has a pretty good success rate, but sometimes the alliance just joins the war later anyway, so it is a little bit risky. If you're going with this option, then chances are you're already later into the game, so my best advice would be to pump out as many armies as you can sustain. If the alliance joins the war, then you'll probably need to be ready for one hell of a fight, but if not, then you have a bunch of armies and you can roll them over in no time flat. Another problem with letting them get to the later game is that Bretonnia are pretty great at confederating, meaning by the time you get to turn 100, that coastline is almost certainly going to be owned by one or two major factions at most. That means more lands to take out, more resources, and more armies to send marching into your lands, because that anti-player bias is oh so fun. Again, the only two options of getting around this are fighting them early or making a shitload of armies once it hits the late game. You can't really tactic your way past them having a lot of land and being really strong, aside from just using common sense when invading. Take entire provinces and move up in a solid line so they can't sneak around and flank you in the back. Both of these points bring us to the main point that Bretonnia are way easier to beat in the early game. If you leave them alone till later, they'll get friends, gold, armies, resources, and more advanced units, making them much harder to take down. The earlier you can take the fight to them, the better you'll be, both in terms of their campaign strength and battle. Speaking of which, we should probably move on to the battle section. Early on, they're total pushovers with mostly peasant armies with literally no stats, and the only things you'll need to worry about are their lords and any odd higher tier units that they're able to get from the get-go. However, as always, we're building armies for the worst case scenario, and in the form of Bretonnia, that means cav. Lots of it. Yes, they do technically have front lines that are okay, but they're not the real threat with lower stats than pretty much any other faction's endgame front lines, so we're going to pretend those don't exist because the AI sure will. So back to the cav, you have three types that you need to worry about. Charges are the most common type and what you're probably used to seeing and using if you played a campaign before. They're fast, have a mean charge bonus but poor melee stats and want to cycle in and out of units to deal tons of damage whilst keeping themselves safe. We also have the sustained melee cav, which drops some speed and charge in exchange for improved melee stats, meaning they can land in combat and stay there dealing steady damage whilst also being able to defend themselves. Lastly, we have the flying cav, which can technically also be either of the other two, but have supreme speed and maneuverability since they can get anywhere and attack from any direction unless you have something flying of your own to stop them. Bretonnia having all three of these makes them a very scary faction to face in battle since they can all attack from basically any angle and be a threat to front lines as easily as backs. Plus you have all the lords, which will also be able to do practically the same thing, the casters, which can bring one of the best laws in the game in the form of the Law of Life. That means tons of healing, support, and a bit of damage, making these threatening units even harder to take down. And if all of that wasn't enough, they have a limited but threatening range roster. The artillery are neat and all, but peasant bowmen with pox arrows are some of the most dangerous units for such a crazy low cost, so do not let them fire for free or you will not live to tell the tale. Now, this entire roster, including all that cav, can be countered by one very simple strategy. If the map allows it, standing in trees can cut the efficacy of most of their army in half. None of their cav units come with woodsmen, meaning moving through trees will significantly slow them down, meaning less impactful charging, and it's harder for them to get away. Plus, their ranged will struggle to land shots between trees. It's a win-win all around. That said, it's not something you'll be guaranteed in every battle, so we're not going to rely on that too much and instead build an army capable of standing up to this alone. So kicking us off with some melee infantry, and to no one's surprise, we're going with whatever has high charge defense and armor piercing damage. Even though sustained melee can have a pretty mean charge, so if we can take the impact out of it as much as possible, we'll be setting ourselves up a lot better for the ensuing melee. Once lines have clashed, we're going to want to move into their units and pin them down to prevent them from pulling away for more charging, especially if they're the cycle charging type. Honestly, if you can get cycle charging cav locked in melee, you should be able to take them down with just infantry since their defense is normally so poor, but of course we're going to bring a few more units than just this to get the job done fast. Either cav of your own or something large like monsters as a bonus versus large is the best way to go to bring a little more damage to your front lines. Just use them like any other monster and get them involved as soon as the lines clash to skyrocket your damage. If they're fast enough, you can even send them around to sandwich units in melee, trapping them completely and likely causing them to die or root in no time. One note on routing: if you have something running, do your best to make sure it shatters. The last thing you want is them rallying and then coming in for a big charge all over again. These, in my case Cav, are also going to be the way that we take down the range threats they decide to bring. You should only need a unit or two on this job at most, since their ranged units' melee stats are so pitifully low, and taking them out should take seconds if the charge doesn't do it instantly. As well as this, they can act as flank protectors, using their high speed to block charges into your flanks, and using their high anti-large armor piercing damage to give enemies a good hiding and take them down if possible. But of course, if we want even more damage, we'll need to rely on a bit of range damage. Look, this is going to be one of the riskiest range setups that we've seen in this series yet, since their entire armor is just so fast that one wrong move and everything can collapse. Place these as safely as you can behind your front lines and space them out so if one does happen to get charged, they don't drag everyone down with them. Prioritize their safety over everything, as they really will go down in moments if you lose focus. However, if you can keep them safe, then you'll be able to churn out damage no matter what you use. Personally, I'd lean on armor piercing if you can, since most of these later game units will be pretty tough without it. It doesn't matter about the firing arc, since they should be able to get off shots no matter what, with Cav sticking just above melee infantry, meaning shots should be doable as long as the terrain isn't too rough. Artillery is okay, but you'll struggle to land shots since they move so fast. I'd instead use this to take down any ranged infantry they have or anything else slow moving. If you don't want it, then don't bother, and you won't be missing out on too much. Lastly, for leadership, I'd say some sort of fast moving fighter would be a great option to get around the map and protect your troops where needed, like backing up ranged troops caught in the flank. I'd also bring a spellcaster with some slowing and weakening capabilities like the Law of Shadow. Making their units easier to catch and pin down will go a long way, and if you can reduce their defenses even further, they'll go down in no time. That's all it really comes down to when trying to beat the Brits. Their entire strategy relies on speed, mass and momentum to plow through armies before they have a chance to mount a defense. If you can interrupt that gameplay and bring them to a halt, then you should have no problem taking them down. They're a lot like the ogres and beastmen in that regard, but even more so. Their threats outside of Cav are very limited, so if you focus on taking down the Cav first, the rest of the army should follow in no time. One last thing to mention when fighting against Bretonnia is that you're still going up against the same janky Total War AI, so chances are they'll do something stupid like they did in my battle, which I actually played twice, and they did the same thing. The Cav clumped up on the sides of the battle and died in combat to my halberd demigryphs, leaving the middle of the map open for me to march straight into their ranged troops. They focused charging on units that could take it and let my ranged fire on them for pretty much free until the end of battle. While this may not be guaranteed with every army comp on every map in every campaign, it's worth remembering that even though the clothing changes, the enemy is always the same and will always make the same brain-dead mistakes until they fix the goddamn AI. That just about wraps up everything on how to beat Bretonnia. If you have any questions or even tips of your own, leave them in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want to know how to beat more factions, then check out this video here on the Beastmen.